Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to talk about what should compensation committees be preparing for in 2021. And joining me is Marc Ullman, who's the managing partner with Meridian Compensation Partners. Welcome, Marc.
Thank you, TK. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So I know, as we talked about the prep for this, that you have three main areas that you want to touch on. And so I'll let you get started with your first thing that compensation committees should be discussing in their meetings, or at least be aware of.
Sure. Well, here we are sitting in January, and while there's a lot of things that comp committees are going to be looking for the whole of 2021, right now everyone's very focused on Q1 decision making. 2020 is still very much in mind. Comp committees need to make decisions about 2020 payouts, need to make decisions on 2021 annual incentives, 2021 long-term incentives. So top of mind right now is still current practical matters, like what are we going to do for the 2020 year? And I think what we're ready to see is some more bold decisions by comp committees than we've seen traditionally. Comp committees this year, more so than ever, are going to need to make sure that the pay for performance link is intact. And so one of the things Meridian did is we did a pulse survey at the end of last year, at the beginning of December, to find out what was going to happen on a go-forward basis versus then just looking backwards. And what we heard from the participants were stories that were quite different than what we had heard throughout 2020. Things like, were annual incentive plans going to be changed in the middle of the year? Were they going to shorten performance periods in the middle of the year? So here we are in Q1 of 2021, where real life happened, and now decisions need to be made. And our pulse survey helped us see the fact that most companies did not intervene with their annual incentive plans. Most companies left their annual incentive plans intact and were going to rely on a much greater dose of discretion. That's for the annual incentive plan for 2020. So normally discretion is a dirty word when it comes to annual incentive plans, but I think for the 2020 plan year, we're going to see a very healthy dose of discretion. And some of those decisions that comp committees make might be falling under the head of bold. Same holds true for long-term incentives for 2021. We learned from our pulse survey that most companies are not going to intervene on old long-term incentive cycles, even those that were blown up. We know for many companies, 3 outstanding long-term incentive cycles will not pay out for many, many companies. But we did see, and we will see, bold moves by comp committees in 2021. It might be in the form of one-time equity grants. It might be in the form of modifying outstanding LTI grants, which is very unusual. Even if we see a very small number of companies doing special one-time grants, like 5 or 10% of companies, or that same percentage of companies intervening and modifying outstanding long-term incentive grants, that would be a huge difference from what we normally see. So we think comp committees are going to be bold with decisions based on 2020 and past grants. We also think committees are going to be bold with the go-forward plans. Long-term incentive plan metrics, annual incentive plan metrics are likely to change. We're likely to see a lot more non-financial metrics. Obviously, ESG and human capital metrics are top of mind. Diversity and inclusion metrics are top of mind for comp committees. So we may see more of those metrics finding their way into annual incentive plans for 2021. Whether or not they are standalone metrics or if they stay inside sort of qualitative scorecards for executives remains to be seen. But I think we're very likely to see more progress there.
So your second issue is centered around these governance issues?
Yes, that's right. 2020 was a year where comp committees and companies, quite frankly, were forced to be reactive. And in 2019, a lot of governance matters were top of the agenda for compensation committees, but 2020 pushed a lot of these governance items to the back burner. So we think in 2021, governance matters, and I already mentioned some of these, ESG metrics, diversity and inclusion metrics, but also the good old-fashioned succession planning, good old-fashioned clawbacks. These items are likely to be pushed to the front burner from the back burner as companies are prepared to be more proactive again. I mean, there's probably a fair amount of pent-up attrition out there with companies, making succession planning even more important than it ever was. And of course, clawbacks was not a focus of concern for compensation committees in 2020. How those clawbacks work going forward are probably going to be looked at more carefully by compensation committees, making sure that it's not just the material restatements that trigger a clawback, but going to reputational harm and those sorts of things. So we think 2021, we're likely to see a reemergence of governance matters going up in the agenda.
One of the biggest things I hear, Mark, when I talk to comp committee members and just boards in general, is the challenge of incorporating this stuff into the executive comp plan. You know, the measurability of what gets measured in ESG. How do we do the social aspect? What happens with stakeholder capitalism? You know, all that stuff on how that's going to work into plans seems like that's going to be a challenge. So how have you seen people getting their arms around that challenge?
Well, you're absolutely right. ESG metrics, this is a field that, while not new, the measurement aspect of this is somewhat new and still pretty dynamic. So I think companies are looking to better understand the metrics. They're using a rationale in terms of how do we incorporate this, or do we incorporate ESG type metrics in our incentive plan, and how can we do that when the metrics are not yet fully understood? What we're seeing is companies who have already gone down the road in ESG with sophisticated approaches to dealing with environmental, social, and governance matters, they're in a better position to perhaps include ESG type metrics in their incentive plans on a standalone basis. But most companies are not there. Most companies are still trying to get their arms around that, and these metrics, while still important, they're landing, as I said earlier, in the qualitative scorecards for individual performance. So what I think will happen in 2021 is the early movers that put in ESG type metrics early on may reevaluate and take a step back and ask themselves, did we do this right? Whether it be a standalone metric that they may want to reevaluate, or do they want to take a metric that was in a qualitative scorecard and move it into a standalone part of the incentive plan? So I think this will be a time when companies, forgive the pun, take stock in how the ESG is working for them and in their incentive plans, and whether or not they want to use ESG metrics in their incentive plan yet. I think it's not a matter of if, it's more a matter of when and how companies will bring these types of metrics into the plan. And I think it's for the reasons you said. It's still a little squishy, in quotes.
Well, the good news is there's a lot of people working on these metrics. You know, the World Economic Forum, there's some international CEO groups with the World Economic Forum working on that. I mean, everybody, SASB, everybody's working on metrics. So I suspect that we'll just see continued improvement as time goes on. So Mark, we got about 2 minutes left, and I know you want to cover a third general area that people should be thinking about on the compensation committee. So what would that be?
Well, that would be the Biden administration. And here we are, as we speak, the inauguration is going on. And so the Biden administration is that third item. One of the things we know is a potential increase to the corporate tax from 21 to 28. So companies are going to have to figure out how that may impact their incentive plans. Do they need to rethink the definitions of their metrics? Do they need to rethink how they set targets for those metrics? So the Biden administration and the tax rate is one. Regulation, the regulatory environment under the Biden administration is likely to pivot as well. The SEC is a big important organization where rules around pay for performance and clawbacks are likely to get put on the short-term agenda, moved off the long-term agenda. But we know these things go back and forth. So, I think there's a big question mark on how the Biden administration will impact exec comp.
So where I know you guys do a lot of work in the compensation committee space, do a lot of papers, have white papers, have research. What's the website that people can go to get further information?
Well, you can go to www.meridiancp for compensation partners, meridiancp.com, and you'll find many, if all of our insights on our new website.
Well, Mark, thanks for taking the time to join us. It's going to be an interesting year, particularly with the comp committee. So we'll have to take a look back in a couple months and see sort of what has transpired. So thanks again for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you, TK.
So that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.